All right, for our next reading standard, we are going to talk about interpretation. In the grade book, it's listed as interpretation and relationships. And that is the language that AP uses when they're talking about theme, essentially. So when they say relationships, what they're talking about is what is the relationship between ideas within a text? What is the relationship between this text and our world? Anything that kind of develops meaning from the passage is what this standard is about. So I think the simplest way to kind of talk about it is in terms of theme. Now, poems can have themes just like prose passages will. There is one differentiation I want to point out, though, the difference between a topic and a theme. So a topic is going to be a big idea, which we've talked about in the past, okay? So a topic is something like perseverance, friendship, loyalty. But that does not equate to a theme, because a theme is an actual statement about what the text means, okay? So when we're talking about interpretation relationships, I don't want you to just say, this is a poem about friendship. That's too basic, okay? We're looking for something bigger than that, which is theme. Now, a good trick that I've been taught in kind of taught to pick out a good theme statement is called the 3-step theme. So step 1 is to start with that big idea. So it might be friendship, for example. Then create a 3-word statement, and that would be friendship is tested. So this like 3-word statement is kind of like if you had to capture that book in 3 words, how would you do that, including that big idea? And then to finish it, you just add when to finish the statement. So for example, friendship is tested when people must confront their limitations. All right, that would be an example for like of Mice and Men. But this kind of system, this 3-step theme, is something that I think creates really good theme statements. Sometimes they do get a little bit wordy, so I think once you have your theme statement using this process, then you should kind of cut it back as needed and condense it into a succinct statement about theme. But I think as we're kind of getting started with that idea, let's use this 3-step theme process because it's a good place to start in how you go about creating a theme statement. So with a poem, I mean, it's the same thing. You'd start with what is the poem about, that big topic or big idea. If you had to capture what that poem is about in 3 words, and then complete the statement with when. All right. One method that has been used throughout kind of literary analysis history is what's called a critical lens analysis. And essentially, it's called a lens because it's kind of how you look at a text. You put on these glasses, so to speak, and that's kind of how you focus your reading, okay? So we're going to talk about 5. There are very many and very diverse types of critical lenses. These ones I think are really kind of the more approachable ones in some ways, but I also think they're the ones that apply to a lot of different texts. So I'm going to be honest, this part is confusing, especially if I can't walk you through it with necessarily a detailed text of this kind of analysis. But I'm going to kind of give you the basics of it. I want you to know that this is not something that they're going to ask you about on the test. It's not something that you need to know necessarily to get a passing score on the exam. But these kind of critical lenses are just a way of thinking about your reading that's going to create those elevated observations that kind of get the higher scoring essay. So follow with me, take your notes like I said, but don't stress yourself out if this is so overwhelmingly confusing. I just want to make sure that you're aware of this method because some people find it really helpful. So let's start with psychoanalytic theory. This one is probably one of my favorite critical lenses because it's kind of looking at the book as a psychologist, so to speak. So if you're someone that's taken psych or AP psych, this is a lens that you can use pretty fluidly, I think, and use well. So what the psychoanalytic theory does is it looks at the characters like they're people, right? What about their psychological state is creating issues for them? Why does it motivate their actions? Things like that. So there's just a couple ways of analyzing for psychoanalysis that I'm going to point out. There are many, many more than this. I'm kind of leaving it to the more familiar terms, I think. The first one is displacement. Displacement is when someone will possibly displace their anger on someone else. So for example, if I am mad at my mom and then I go talk to Miss Peterson and I yell at her because of it, that's me displacing my anger towards my mom onto Miss Peterson. Okay? So if I was doing a psychoanalytic analysis,
we have messages in the office
1 second.
for Jaden Feist, Alexa Strom, Jacob Kojo, Jaden Fisher, Tanner Fritz, and Matt Moore.
Okay. So if we're talking about this in terms of a psychoanalytic criticism, I might talk about how a character does the same thing, right? Because Hamlet is stressed out about avenging his father's death, he yells and makes fun of Ophelia. And that would be an example of doing a psychoanalytic analysis using this idea of displacement. Okay? The next one is this idea of the unconscious. So, just like you and I make subconscious or unconscious decisions, we can talk about the unconscious decisions of a character. So, again, you could talk about how in the play Hamlet, okay, Hamlet's father has died and he sees his ghost at the beginning, and the rest of the play is him basically talking himself into killing the person who's responsible. So part of that situation is Hamlet's mother has married that person after her husband's death. And you could say that when Hamlet is yelling at Ophelia, his own love interest, he is unconsciously taking out his anger towards his mom on another female just because she's a female, okay? So anytime you can talk about those, I guess, non-surface level actions of a character where they're acting unknowingly, you'd be speaking about their unconscious. Another word would be repression. You've probably heard the idea of repressing a memory. That's something that, again, you could analyze in a text, in a character. You could also do it with the author, though, like if you know enough about the author, which I wouldn't expect, but you could talk about how that F. Scott Fitzgerald depiction of Daisy is really a manifestation of the anger he's repressed towards his own wife, okay? You can talk about, for example, with Slaughterhouse-Five, how Billy Pilgrim has repressed memories from the war and how they're manifesting and shaping the novel as a whole. So that would be an example of how repression can be analyzed. Oops. The next word is denial. I'm all sure you know that idea of a character who's in denial or a person who's in denial. You can apply that to characters and kind of create that leveled analysis about why are they in denial, what does that denial say about them as a character, and it kind of contributes to an overall character analysis. Another word is projection. Okay, when I project something, I might be, it's very similar to displacement, But for example, if I am projecting on my boyfriend what I want him to be, I am going to be holding him to this really high standard, right? That would be me projecting what I want onto him. So in this case, a character could do the same, and you could analyze why that is. Or you could talk about how an author is projecting their ideals of what a good person should be on a particular character, and that would be a psychoanalytic analysis. And the last few things, I'm going to put these together, but fear and trauma. Anytime you talk about how trauma affects a character or how an author's trauma shows up in their writing, that would be a psychoanalytic analysis. And then the last one, don't make it weird, but we're going to talk about sex for a minute, because psychoanalytic analysis is really 90% about sex. Okay, so some things that you might pick out into text. Phallic symbols. I think you all know what a phallic symbol is. If not, I was going to say Google it. Don't Google it. But you could ask me and I'll awkwardly explain it to you. But if an author talks about something in a way that reminds you of a phallic image, then there might be some sort of analysis you can do tied to that character's sexuality, tied to their manlyhood, things like that. And that would be a psychoanalytic analysis. You can also, for example, there's what's called the Oedipus complex. If you're familiar with that, that means someone who is infatuated with their mother and wants to have a relationship with their mother. If you see that in a character, you could obviously do an analysis of that. I think the big thing to talk about when they're when you're trying to analyze sexual imagery is that if it's outright talking about sex, it's not about sex, which sounds contradictory, but sexual imagery is usually more subtle than that, and it'll talk in metaphors, and it'll talk with figurative language instead of coming outright and saying it. And from that, then you talk about what impact does that have on the bigger picture. And that's all I want to say about sex to a bunch of teenagers. But if you have questions about psychoanalytic theory, it's really just taking all these concepts from psychology and applying them to characters and an author. The next one is archetypal, and I think this one is pretty straightforward. But I think the key idea to start with is this idea of what's called intertextuality. Intertextuality simply means the fact that there's a lot of overlap in literature. We talked about archetypes kind of with characters, but there's a lot of examples of heroes in literature. That's intertextuality, because all of those texts are connected by that unifying archetype. So when you're doing an archetypal theory analysis, all you're doing is studying why that archetype is there. So for example, you might pick out Daisy from The Great Gatsby as an innocent, and then you would talk about why is that relevant, and you could connect it to things like Daisy is your archetypal innocent character because at the time that's what society wanted women to be, right? And that would be an example of archetypal analysis. So really, this one's pretty simple. It's just applying, maybe applying isn't the word I want, but it's analyzing archetypes and the use of them. So that one's just kind of building on something we already talked about. The next one is Marxist theory. And Marxist theory is complicated, but I think the basic premise, or the simplest way to kind of capture what Marxist criticism looks like, is when you, as the person analyzing the text, consider how economic systems shape the human experience. Now, that off the cuff, you're probably thinking, like, what does economy have to do with certain texts like The Great Gatsby or The Crucible or things like that. They seem like very disconnected things. But a Marxist analysis is going to talk about power. It's going to talk about class and the difference between classes. It's going to talk about the American dream, because that's an economic aspiration. So, for example, with The Great Gatsby, a lot of people have done analysis of how Jay Gatsby embodies the American dream. That is a Marxist analysis. It's going to talk about consumerism. So, for example, in Fahrenheit 451, these people are surrounded by these huge televisions. A Marxist theory is going to talk about how that is a reflection of mass consumption of media or something like that. A Marxist analysis is going to talk about greed. How does greed motivate characters? Things like that. It's going to talk about economic imperialism, which is a really fancy word for like monopolizing, okay? Really, a Marxist analysis is just looking at how these concepts create meaning in a text. So, for example, if you have, there's a book called Animal Farm, and in Animal Farm, all the characters are animals, but it is an allegory for the process that communism followed to take over. So when we're talking about a Marxist analysis, that's talking about communists as a main power. It's talking about the different classes, because each of the different animals, there's the pigs, which are the top class, and then there's subsequent classes after that. That would be a Marxist analysis. Now, with all of these, I'm kind of using novels as examples because I think they're a little bit easier to apply. But if I talk about how a poem is creating imagery that is parallel to a current class system, that would be a Marxist analysis. If I'm talking about if it's a poem about a weed slowly taking over a garden, I can talk about how that's a metaphor for a power-hungry person trying to take over a community, right? That would be a Marxist analysis. Okay, the new colonialism theory, this one I just kind of find particularly interesting, and I think especially as we are doing Unit 2 and you're reading some of your books by global writers, this is kind of an interesting way of looking at them. But new colonialism or post-colonialism talks about, like it sounds, colonization. So you remember earlier in the year we read the passage from the Poisonwood Bible, and a lot of that is talking about how Europeans came in and essentially eliminated what was Africa's culture, or tried to, so to speak. So any type of analysis regarding that would be a post-colonial or new colonial analysis. So some things that you would analyze is the idea of hybridity, which is just a fancy word of saying two cultures. So if I was to write about how the main character that we read about in Poisonwood Bible is conflicted between who she is as an American and what she saw in Africa, that is an example of hybridity. And if I can talk about why that exists in the text, I'm doing a colonialist analysis, okay? Another thing you could analyze is this idea of invasion. If there is one group, one person, one concept that is overtaking another.
Leader, Bapa, please come to the office. Leader, Bapa, please come to the office.
Sorry about that. But if you have any kind of imagery where one group is taking over another or one character is taking over another, and you talk about how that invasion is contributing to the larger meaning of the text, you'd be doing a post-colonial analysis. Another thing you could analyze is the idea of assimilation. So, for example, if we talk about how in The Great Gatsby, Jay is forced to try to fit this model of what wealth looks like, but he is always separated from the old money of East Egg. If we make a comparison between that and how we expect people of different cultures to assimilate and change, we're doing a colonialist analysis, okay? And then the last word to know is indigenous. I don't think I spelled that right. But meaning native to a certain area. Really, the biggest thing with new colonialism is you are talking about culture, essentially, okay? And how maybe one culture eclipses another. And you can apply that to poetry, too, because like I said, if you see imagery of one abstract idea, one thing kind of overcoming another, that is an idea of, you could be applying a colonialist analysis. Okay, and then the last one, and I won't lie, my favorite, but I'm a little biased, is feminist or gender theory, okay? This one I think is more approachable just because some of the terminology is really commonly used in our current discourse. But the essential basis of this type of analysis is you are analyzing or analysis of how women are oppressed. And that would include economically, it would include politically, socially, and psychologically. This being kind of the key word. Any sort of analysis where you're talking about a female character being oppressed because of her gender, you are doing a feminist analysis, okay? Now, that said, there's really kind of a broad scope of analysis because the same can be applied to like a homosexual character or any character who's different, and it kind of works the same way. So it's kind of fluid in terms of how it can be applied to different texts and different situations. But a few key words for feminist theory would be patriarchy, and that is the idea of the male-dominated society or leadership class. So if I'm reading a poem and I attribute some leader or ruling power, for example, if it's a poem about, what's a good example? Trying to think of. Okay, if it's a poem about a squirrel and there's one squirrel who's stealing all the acorns from everyone else, if I attribute that to the male patriarchy being greedy towards money or wealth or jobs or something, I'm doing a feminist analysis. If you talk about gender roles, that is a feminist analysis. So if you talk about a character who decides to break from traditional gender roles, and if you kind of go on to explain why that matters to the text, that would be a feminist analysis. So for example, the book Their Eyes Were Watching God. The main character, Janie, is married 3 separate times, all really kind of dismal, ultimately. And because if I'm looking at that with a feminist lens, I'm going to talk about how slowly she kind of moved further and further away from her traditional gender role until ultimately she was true to herself. So for example, we could talk about she wears dresses while she's married, but when she's alone talking to her friend at the end, she's in pants, right? That kind of shift and analysis of the gender role and how it changes would be a feminist analysis. Another word is misogyny, which is similar to sexism, but misogyny means specifically from men. So if you talk about a character being misogynistic, that would be a feminist analysis. And then like I said, there's also this idea of being other. So this kind of same analysis could also work for any kind of group that's minority or discriminated against. It obviously wouldn't be called feminist theory again, but you don't really need to know what it's called to do that sort of analysis. So the same way that I would analyze how the patriarchy limits the opportunities of women, I might talk about how certain faith cultures limit the opportunities of homosexual people. Like, that's this idea of being other or outside is a great form of analysis when you kind of see that happening. So those are the critical lenses. Now, like I said, I understand that it is very confusing. I expect it to be very confusing. But if there's something in one of them that resonates, that's something that you can kind of see yourself using, go ahead. Now, will I have a test where I expect you to tell me what a feminist analysis of this would look like? No. But this is just a way of kind of creating that mastery level thesis development, that higher level thinking that can elevate your writing. The next thing is to talk about sound. Now, sound is tricky because, first and foremost, it's hard to talk about because how do you describe a sound, really? But it doesn't really fit into any of our other characters. It's not really structure. It's not really figurative language, so to speak. But it is something that you can analyze with poetry, so I kind of just threw it in here because I want you to be aware of it. And so when you see it, you can use it. But that said, it's probably a little bit misplaced being in here with theme, just because it's not necessarily about interpretation. But I wanted to make sure you knew some of these terms and things like that so that if it appears in your multiple choice, you know what it's talking about, but also that as you do a poetry analysis, you can use. So the first thing I'd like you to do is stop the video and define these 4 words for me: alliteration, assonance, onomatopoeia, consonants. If you know the definition, which I am hoping you know the definition of at least one of those, you can just paraphrase it for yourself, okay? But first things first, these are just 4 really common devices or poetic devices that you can analyze in your writing. So just take a second to review those definitions and write them in your notes, please. Okay. The next 2 terms I want to talk about are 2 poetic devices that can be used and analyzed when you're doing your poetry analysis. But I think they are kind of hard to talk about without really kind of knowing what it looks like, okay? So the 2 devices are euphony and cacophony, and they're opposites. Euphony means that things are in harmony or that it's neat, okay? Cacophony means,
Mr. Thorson, please call the activities office. Mr. Thorson, please call the activities office.
Cacophony means that it's dissonant or messy. So when we're talking about the sound of poetry, there's a certain rhythm that's created, which we'll talk about in a second. But what euphony and cacophony show are poetry that's kind of sing-song and lyrical and everything fits and works together nicely, versus cacophony where you kind of stumble over the words a little bit. So I have 2 examples that I've got for you. Oops, that's not what I wanted. This is what I wanted. Let me open it in Word quickly. But there are 2 poems. The first one is by Emily Dickinson, and it's called A Bird Came Down the Walk. So when we're looking at this, I want to look at a few things before I even read it to you. Just looking, we know these rhyme. These rhyme. These rhyme in a British accent. And the size of each stanza is very similar, right? Now let me read it to you. A bird came down the walk, he did not know I saw. He bit an angleworm in half and ate the fellow raw. And then he drank a dew from a convenient glass, and then hopped sideways to the wall to let a beetle pass. So as you're listening to this out loud, are you already hearing how the stanzas are parallel in that they all kind of fit together nicely. Things rhyme and end in clean statements, things like that. If we were to count syllables, which I already did kind of ahead of time, but every stanza goes, there's 6 syllables, 8, 6, then it goes 6, 6, 8, 6. So when I'm talking about euphonia, I'm talking about this harmony, right? Everything fits together nicely, things rhyme, it's pleasant to read out loud because it has that song-like quality. Now if we look at this one, I'm going to read the first paragraph for you. My stick fingers click with a snicker, and chuckling they knuckle the keys. Light-footed, my steel feelers flicker, and pluck from these keys melodies. My paper can caper, abandoned, is broadcast by dint of my din, and no man or band has a hand in the tone I turn on from within. Okay? There is still rhyme happening. Like this rhymes, this rhymes, this rhymes, that rhymes as well. But there's a few things that I want to point out. For example, this is a great example of cacophony. Take a second and try to say that line. Light-footed, my steel feelers flicker. The syllables or the consonants in there, your mouth will stumble over them, okay? Similarly, let's look at this last piece. At times, I'm a jumble of rumbles. At others, I'm light like the moon, but never my numb plunker fumbles, misstrums me, or tires a new tune. This is another example right here. There are so many syllables happening, and as you say them out loud, your mouth or your tongue is going to kind of stumble through them, right? That's an example of cacophony. It means that it doesn't read nicely and sing-songy like the other poem did. It means that there's some intentional challenge in reading that poem out loud. So that said, if we're looking at the context of these two poems, the first one is about, a pretty little bird walking down the street. That makes sense to have a sing-song, nice, like Disney princess type quality to it. It fits, it rhymes, it's in harmony. This one is talking about kind of a organic playing the piano situation with the speaker of it, right? Whereas if I'm playing the piano, it's not necessarily going to be in harmony all the time. There are songs that are difficult. If you think about jazz music in particular, that's a kind of good metaphor really for what cacophony will look like in a poem. So what I would do then is, what is the meaning of using that sing-song quality in the other poem? What is the meaning behind using that cacophony in this poem? What does it reveal? How does it contribute to the work as a whole? So that's euphony and cacophony. And they're just two poetic devices that I think, if you recognize them, they can be a really good source of analysis. All right, next, pause the video again for me because I have a whole bunch of terms that I want you to define. So when we talk about rhyme, that means that the words sound similar, and there are many types, and all of these words, unfortunately, have another word that means the same thing. So if you find that one, take note of it while you're defining them. But these are pretty straightforward. I think once you find the definition, you won't have a lot of questions about what that is. I'm more concerned with telling you how to analyze that, okay? So take a second, pause the video, and go through and define those 5 types of rhyme, please. All right, the next thing I want to talk about is rhythm. So poetry has a rhythm to it. That's what makes it poetry, right? That's what makes it different than reading a novel. It has intentional attention. Attention is paid to what's emphasized, the different syllables that are stressed and unstressed, and that's what kind of creates the rhythm, okay? So when we're talking about rhythm, there's kind of the two pieces, which is rhythm itself, which is the pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables. And then there is the meter, which is the length of lines. Now these two things together can can be annotated by looking at what's called the scansion. Now, scansion is very complicated. It's kind of like the critical lenses. I think you can do a beautiful analysis about them. But scansion is essentially figuring out the meter and the rhythm. So the simplest way to kind of describe that to you is iambic pentameter. Maybe you talked about that when you were a freshman, I'm not sure, but iambic pentameter is what Shakespeare wrote all of his plays in. And it uses this unstressed, stressed rhythm throughout, and every line has 5 patterns or 5 repetitions of that pattern. So you have that heartbeat, the ba-bump, 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 ba-bump. That is iambic pentameter. Now, there are variations on that as it goes from there, but I think the best way to kind of show you how to talk about scansion and rhythm is to do a quick reading assignment for me. So the books, How to Read Poetry Like a Professor, are in the back cupboard. What I'd like you to do is read chapter 3, which is about scansion and about rhythm and meter. So I'm hoping that can kind of explain it better than I can. Again, it's not going to be hugely necessary that you really understand that, but I want you to be aware of that kind of analysis because it does exist and people use it all the time. Furthermore, there have in the past been multiple choice questions about is this in iambic pentameter or whatever. So I want you to see them once so you know them. But ultimately, when you do an analysis, I would want you to talk about, okay, why does this poem have a very upbeat rhythm? If you can talk about that by talking about the number of stressed and unstressed syllables, that could be a really good analysis too. So just for your knowledge, but go ahead and read chapter 3 of the text and add to your notes, please. The next thing to talk about is interruptions in the rhythm of a poem. So there's 3 types, well, not really 3 types, but 3 poetic devices that kind of are associated with rhythm and breaks in the rhythm. The first one being caesura, which is a stop that happens mid-verse. So that might be a period. It's going to be some sort of punctuation that kind of breaks it right in the middle of the line. Could be a semicolon, whatever it is. The piano player example we just had examples of it. Whereas enjambment is when a line continues to the next verse. So instead of having that ending at the end of the verse of poetry, the thought or the sentence continues on to the next line, and that would be enjambment. And then the end stop is when it just stops at the end of the line. So analyzing those things, you'd be telling me, why does it stop in the middle of the line? Why does it have that interruption in the rhythm? What does that contribute to what the poem is saying, right? Enjambment, if you have a lot of lines that are carrying off into the next one, you kind of get that rhythm of someone who's rambling or kind of going on and on and on, and that is something you could analyze, that use of enjambment. Or end stop, if you have a poem where every verse ends with punctuation, you're going to create a really staccato or abrupt rhythm, and you could talk about why does that rhythm contribute to the meaning of the work. So those are just 3 kind of poetic devices that can be associated with rhythm. All right. Now here's the thing. Analyzing sound and rhythm, I think, is probably the most challenging form of analysis, but I also think, especially with poetry, it's a great source of analysis because that's how poems work. When someone sits down to write a poem, they're thinking about how it sounds and how it comes across to the reader. I mean, originally poetry was never written down, it was spoken, and you can tell even today some of the most beautiful poetry is still spoken word poetry exclusively because it has to have that rhythm and that movement in it for it to be most successful. So, just like with our figurative language and everything else, When you're talking about sound and rhythm, you're looking for what does it contribute to the meaning, kind of connecting back to that idea of theme, right? What kind of emotion does it evoke, or what does it emphasize? These, just like I said in the other video, these are your three big whys. What can you find in that poetic device that is contributing to meaning? Or what does that poetic device contribute to the emotions of the reader or the poem? Or what does that poetic device emphasize? So same applies when we're talking about sound, about the rhyme, about those devices about sound, euphonia or cacophony, or the rhythm and meter as well. Now the last thing I kind of want to touch on with interpretation is that interpretation is unique. Your interpretation of something is not always going to match up with what someone else interprets. Like we've been saying in our class, it's about making something defensible that you can argue with evidence, okay? Now, there's a difference between interpretation and reflection, however. Reflection is reader-focused, okay? I felt this way when I read the poem, okay? Or I felt I was reminded of da 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 da. It's a lot of focus on I. Interpretation is more about the intention of the writer, okay? What do you think that writer was trying to achieve? Now, I don't mean writers. Lost my R and my E. So interpretation is what do you think the interpretation or the intention of the writer was? And that's where it's going to vary, right? I think in the resources folder, I have an example from The Road Not Taken, in which I have my interpretation of what it means, but I also have Mrs. Carnick's interpretation of what it means. And they're widely different because we have different backgrounds in some regards, okay? So the biggest takeaway when we're talking about interpretation relationships, which is your last kind of standard we're looking at with poetry, is that theme is personal to who you are, but it's not about you, if that makes sense. I think a lot of times the inclination with poetry FRQs is to say like, well, this made me as a reader feel this, or this reminded me of the time that this happened. That's not what the College Board is looking for when we're talking about analytic writing. They're looking for what do you think the intention of the writer was. So remember to keep that focus as you're doing your FRQs and writing and creating your own interpretations. All right, that is a lot of information. Like I said, a lot of this video is just things that I want you to be aware of, and we will practice them. It's not like this is a one and done sort of thing. But if you're feeling very overwhelmed and confused by this video, don't panic. It's not like you can't pass the class, can't get a decent grade on the mock exams, anything like that without fully understanding these things. But I just want to give you every opportunity to be successful. So embrace what you understand in here, and then we'll go from there.